January 7th, 1945. The air in the Ardennes forest was a physical entity, a crystalline predator that bit at any exposed flesh and stole the warmth from a man's very soul. For General Major Friedrich von Littenheim, the cold was no longer just a meteorological condition. It was the state of his world, the encroaching frost on a failed ambition. His command post, a hastily commandeered Belgian farmhouse, offered little solace. The stone walls seemed to sweat with a damp chill, and the remaining maps on the great oak table were curled at the edges, monuments to plans that had dissolved like breath in the frigid air. The grand offensive, the last desperate gamble known to the Allies as the Battle of the Bulge, was over for him and his men. The spearhead had been blunted, the flanks were collapsing, and the relentless machinery of the American army was grinding his division into dust. He could hear it now, a distant, percussive rhythm that was growing steadily louder, the drumbeat of his own defeat. It was a sound he knew intimately, the symphony of artillery, but this time, the notes were all playing against him. He stood by the window, its glass latticed with frost, and stared out at the ghost-white landscape. The towering pines were heavy with snow, their branches bowed as if in mourning. A single raven, black as pitch, sat on a skeletal branch, a silent observer to the end of an era. Friedrich, a man of 57 years, felt the weight of every single one of them pressing down on his shoulders. He was a product of the old Prussian military tradition, a lineage of soldiers who valued duty, discipline, and an unyielding composure above all else. His father had served the Kaiser. His grandfather had fought under von Moltke. They were men of iron, men who did not break, who did not bend. And yet, here he was, cornered, his men exhausted, out of ammunition, out of fuel, out of hope. The reports had been coming in all morning, each one a nail in the coffin of his command. The forward positions were overrun. The supply lines were not just cut, they were non-existent. The panzers that had once been the iron heart of his force were now just cold, silent statues, scattered across the snow-covered fields, many of them without a single drop of petrol to bring them to life. He had done everything according to the book, followed every order, executed every maneuver with the precision he had been taught since he was a boy at the military academy. But the book had not accounted for this. It had not accounted for the sheer, overwhelming material superiority of the enemy. The sky black with their aircraft, the roads choked with their trucks and tanks, the airwaves filled with their confident, easy chatter. He ran a gloved hand over his face, the leather worn and smooth. The stubble on his chin was flecked with gray, more so now than a month ago. He felt a profound, bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. It was the weariness of a man who has seen the logical conclusion of his life's work and found it to be abject failure. A young lieutenant, his face pale and smudged with dirt, entered the room without knocking, his breathing ragged. "General Major, they are here, the Americans. They have surrounded the farmhouse." Friedrich did not turn. He continued to gaze out at the snow. "All positions?" he asked, his voice calm, measured. "Everywhere, sir. They have tanks on the main road and infantry advancing through the woods on both sides. We have no clear path of retreat." The general major nodded slowly. Retreat. The word itself was a phantom. There was nowhere to retreat to. There was only this cold, stone house at the end of a long and bloody road. "Have the men destroy the sensitive documents, all codes, all operational plans. Then, they are to lay down their arms. There will be no final, pointless stand. We have lost. The duty we have now is to the lives of the men who are left." The lieutenant hesitated, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and a strange, heartbreaking flicker of relief. "Sir?" "You have your orders, Lieutenant. See to them." The young officer snapped a rigid, almost reflexive salute, turned, and left the room. The sounds of hurried activity began, the tearing of paper, the clatter of equipment being disabled. Friedrich was alone again with the encroaching rhythm of the American advance. He walked over to the great table and looked down at the map, at the bold red lines he had drawn with such confidence just a few weeks ago. They looked like bleeding wounds on the parchment now. He traced the path of his division's initial success, the brief, heady days when it seemed the gamble might just pay off, when the anemic winter sun had glinted off the barrels of his tanks as they pushed westward. It felt like a lifetime ago, a memory from another man's war. He heard the crunch of boots on snow, the shouted commands in a language he understood but had only ever heard through the crackle of a radio receiver. They were close now. Very close. He unbuckled his holster, a beautifully crafted piece of leather his father had given him upon his graduation. He laid the pistol on the table, its dark metal stark against the pale map. Then he removed his officer's cap, placing it beside the weapon. He ran a hand through his thinning silver hair and straightened his uniform, the knight's cross at his neck feeling suddenly, absurdly heavy. He was General Major Friedrich von Littenheim. He would face this as he had faced everything else in his life, with his back straight and his composure intact. The farmhouse door splintered open, and the cold air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of pine and engine exhaust. Figures in unfamiliar olive-drab uniforms filled the doorway, their rifles held at the ready. They were young, their faces pink from the cold, their eyes wary but not cruel. An American officer, a captain by his insignia, stepped forward. "General Major von Littenheim?" he asked, his voice steady. Friedrich drew himself to his full height. "I am," he replied in clear, unaccented English. The captain nodded, his gaze flicking to the pistol on the table, and then back to the general major's face. "You are my prisoner, sir." Friedrich gave a single, curt nod in return. The room was filled with American soldiers now, their movements efficient, professional. They began to check the other rooms, their quiet competence a stark contrast to the desperate energy that had filled the space only minutes before. For Friedrich, the world had shrunk to this single room, to the faces of his captors. The cacophony of the war, the roar of battle, the screams of men, had all faded away, replaced by a profound and ringing silence. In that silence, he felt the first tremor of a fear he had not allowed himself to acknowledge for years. It was not the fear of being captured, nor the fear for his own life. It was the fear of the unknown, of what came next. He had been a captor many times, had seen what happened to those on the losing side. He had heard the stories, the propaganda, the whispers from the Eastern Front. He steeled himself, layering his face with the impassive mask of the Prussian officer. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. Not now, not ever. The long journey into captivity had begun. Section 2. The journey into uncertainty. The journey from the captured farmhouse was a disorienting blur of motion and muted colors. General Major Friedrich von Littenheim was placed in the back of an American Jeep, a vehicle that felt flimsy and exposed compared to the solid, imposing staff cars he was accustomed to. The cold was even more biting here, a relentless wind whipping past the open sides of the vehicle, carrying with it fine, stinging particles of snow. He sat between two young soldiers, boys really, whose faces were a mixture of awe and suspicion. They held their rifles across their laps, their knuckles white, but they did not speak to him. They simply watched, their eyes occasionally darting towards the knight's cross at his neck, as if it were some strange and potent artifact. The captain who had taken his surrender sat in the front passenger seat, occasionally turning to look at him, his expression unreadable. The world outside the Jeep was a tableau of defeat. The road was littered with the remnants of his own army. A burned-out Panzer IV lay, half in a ditch, its long cannon pointing accusingly at the sky. A column of his men, now prisoners like him, trudged along the side of the road, their gray greatcoats blending into the winter landscape, their heads bowed, guarded by more of the ubiquitous American soldiers. He saw their faces as the jeep sped past, faces etched with exhaustion, hunger, and a profound, hollow emptiness. These were his men, men he had led, men for whom he was responsible. He felt a pang of something sharp and bitter, a feeling he identified as shame, and he quickly suppressed it. Emotion was a luxury, a weakness he could not afford. His duty now was to maintain his dignity, to represent the German officer corps with honor, even in the face of this ultimate humiliation. He forced himself to look forward, to focus on the details of his immediate surroundings. The efficiency of the Americans was what struck him most. It was not the rigid, formal efficiency of his own military, but a kind of chaotic, practical effectiveness. Jeeps and trucks churned past them in both directions, their tires wrapped in chains that bit into the icy road. The soldiers they passed seemed relaxed, almost casual, some smoking, others shouting jokes to one another. There was an air of confident mastery over their environment that he found both irritating and deeply unsettling. This was not the decadent, undisciplined army that the propaganda had promised them they would face. This was a force that moved with a purpose and a power that was terrifying in its scale. The journey continued for what felt like hours, deeper and deeper into the American-held rear. They passed through small Belgian towns, their stone houses bearing the scars of recent fighting. Civilians peered from their windows, their faces grim, their eyes following the jeep with a mixture of fear and hatred. He was the enemy here, the invader, and he felt their collective gaze like a physical weight. He had always tried to think of the war in abstract terms, a grand strategic chess match played out on maps. But here, in the faces of these people, was the messy human reality of it all. They stopped once, at a temporary checkpoint. An American military policeman, a large man with a thick mustache, leaned in and peered at him. "Well, well," the MP said, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Looks like you boys caught a big one." The captain in the front seat simply nodded. "Keep the road clear, Corporal. We've got a schedule to keep." The MP waved them through, and the jeep lurched back into motion. Friedrich had expected taunts, jeers, perhaps worse. But there was none. There was only this cold, professional detachment. It was in some ways more unnerving than open hostility would have been. Hostility was an emotion he could understand, could meet with his own stoic defiance. This impassive processing felt like he was no longer a man, a general, but simply a piece of intelligence, an asset to be cataloged and transported. As dusk began to settle, painting the snow in shades of bruised purple and gray, they arrived at what appeared to be a divisional command center, established in a larger chateau that had been commandeered for the purpose. Lights blazed from the windows, generators hummed, and the air was thick with the smell of diesel and coffee. Here, the pace of activity was even more frenetic. He was escorted from the jeep and into the chateau, his guards on either side. The entrance hall was magnificent, with a grand staircase and portraits of long-dead aristocrats still hanging on the walls. But now, it was filled with radio equipment, stacks of ammunition crates, and American officers bustling about with files and maps. They looked up as he entered, their conversations momentarily ceasing. He felt 100 pairs of eyes on him, a silent wave of curiosity. He kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, his back rigid. A major, a man with a tired, intelligent face, approached the captain. "This is him?" the major asked, his voice low. "General Major Friedrich von Littenheim," the captain confirmed. "He surrendered his command element about 3 hours ago." The major looked at Friedrich, his eyes conducting a swift, professional assessment. "All right. Take him to the study. Colonel Wallace will want to be informed immediately. I'll be in to see him in a few minutes." Friedrich was led down a corridor and into a large, wood-paneled study. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace, casting a warm, flickering light on the rows of leather-bound books that lined the walls. It was a room of civilized comfort, a jarring contrast to the frozen forest and the harsh realities of the past few weeks. A single guard was posted at the door, and Friedrich was left alone in the room. He stood in the center of the plush carpet, feeling utterly out of place. He was a prisoner. The word echoed in his mind. He had prepared for this moment, had mentally rehearsed it countless times. He knew what was supposed to happen next, the interrogation. He had been trained in counter-interrogation techniques, had been briefed on the enemy's methods. He expected threats, psychological manipulation, perhaps physical coercion. He had heard stories from other officers about the brutality of the Gestapo and the NKVD, and he assumed the Americans, for all their outward casualness, would have their own effective, if perhaps more subtle methods. He steeled his resolve. He would give them his name, rank, and serial number. Nothing more. That was the code. That was the duty. He would not betray his country or his men. He walked over to the fireplace, holding his hands out to the warmth. The heat felt good on his numb fingers. He watched the flames dance and writhe, mesmerized by their chaotic energy. Outside this room, his world had ended. Inside, a new and terrifying chapter was about to begin. He took a deep breath, the air smelling of old paper and wood smoke, and fortified the walls of his mind. He was a rock, an island of Prussian discipline in a sea of American chaos. They would not break him. He would not allow it. He would endure whatever they threw at him, and he would do it with the silent, unyielding strength that was his birthright. The minutes ticked by, marked by the slow, stately chime of a grandfather clock in the corner. The sound was both comforting and ominous, each chime a step closer to the inevitable confrontation. He waited. Section 3. An unexpected encounter. The heavy oak door of the study opened, not with the sharp, intimidating crack he had anticipated, but with a quiet, unobtrusive click. General Major Friedrich von Littenheim turned from the fireplace, his posture automatically straightening, his face setting into a mask of stoic indifference. He expected to see a team of interrogators, grim-faced men in severe uniforms, perhaps a psychologist trained in the art of mental warfare. Instead, a single American officer entered the room and closed the door gently behind him. He was a major, a man perhaps in his early 40s, with sandy hair and a face that seemed more suited to a university lecture hall than a military command post. He was not physically imposing, and his uniform, though correct, seemed worn with a comfortable familiarity rather than starched for intimidation. He carried a simple manila folder under one arm, but his hands were empty, his demeanor relaxed. This was not what Friedrich had expected at all. The major walked towards the center of the room and stopped a respectful distance away. He looked at Friedrich, and his eyes held not the cold glint of an adversary, but a look of weary professionalism, perhaps even a flicker of something akin to empathy. "General Major von Littenheim," he said, his English as clear and unaccented as Friedrich's own. "I am Major Samuel Croft. I've been assigned to speak with you." Friedrich gave a slight, formal inclination of his head. "Major." He offered nothing more, his voice a flat, neutral tone. He would not make this easy for them. He would adhere to the protocol of a prisoner of war. Croft gestured towards one of the two high-backed leather armchairs situated before the fireplace. "Please, General, sit down. There's no need for us to stand on ceremony." Friedrich hesitated for a moment. This was a deviation from the script he had written in his head. An offer of comfort was a classic psychological tactic, designed to lower a prisoner's guard. He knew this. But standing rigidly at attention while his captor sat seemed like a foolish and pointless gesture. After a moment's consideration, he moved to the indicated chair and sat, his back ramrod straight, his hands resting formally on his knees. He would accept the chair, but he would not relax. Major Croft sat in the other armchair, placing the folder on a small table beside him without opening it. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. He didn't begin with a barrage of questions or a list of accusations. Instead, he simply looked at Friedrich for a long moment, his gaze steady and direct. "You've had a long day, General," Croft said, his voice quiet, conversational. "War is a tiresome business, especially when it turns against you." This was another tactic, Friedrich recognized. Establishing a false sense of common ground, the "we're both just soldiers" approach. He would not fall for it. He remained silent, his expression a carefully constructed wall of neutrality. He would force the American to do all the work. Croft did not seem perturbed by the silence. He seemed to expect it. He shifted his gaze to the fire, watching the embers glow. "I was a history professor before all this," he said, almost to himself. "Ancient Rome. I spent my life studying the campaigns of Caesar and Scipio Africanus. Grand strategy, logistics, the clash of empires. It all seems very clean and noble when you're reading about it in a library a couple of thousand years later." He looked back at Friedrich. "It's a different thing altogether when you can smell the cordite and feel the ground shake, isn't it?" Friedrich's jaw tightened. This was a more sophisticated approach than he had anticipated. The American was trying to draw him into a philosophical discussion, to find a crack in his professional armor. He would not give him one. "I am required to provide you with my name, rank, and serial number," Friedrich stated, his voice cold and precise. "I will provide you with nothing more." Major Croft nodded, a faint, wry smile touching his lips. "I have your name and rank, General. The serial number we can get from your paybook. I appreciate your adherence to the Geneva Convention. I assure you, so do we." He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. "So, let's put that aside for a moment. I'm not here to ask you about troop dispositions or your division's order of battle tonight. My colleagues in G2 will be very interested in that tomorrow, I'm sure. But for now, you are a senior officer who has just come from the front. I am simply interested in your perspective." "My perspective is irrelevant," Friedrich said curtly. "On the contrary," Croft replied smoothly. "Perspective is everything. It's what separates a battle from a massacre, a soldier from a killer. You've been fighting in this war for over 5 years. I've been in it for less than 2. By any measure, you are the more experienced professional." Friedrich felt a flicker of surprise. This was not flattery. It was stated as a simple fact. The American was acknowledging his professional standing, a subtle but effective way of massaging the ego. He had to be careful. This man was more dangerous than a brute with a rubber hose. He was intelligent. "Experience is a harsh teacher," Friedrich allowed, the words escaping before he could stop them. It was a platitude, meaningless, but it was a response. He chided himself internally. Croft seized on the small opening. "That it is, and it has taught you things I can only guess at. You planned a part of this offensive, did you not? From your perspective a few weeks ago, what were the key objectives? What were the critical points you believed would lead to victory?" The questions were operational, but framed as a historical inquiry, a professional discussion between two military men. It was a clever, almost academic approach. Friedrich fell back on his training. "I am not at liberty to discuss operational matters," Croft sighed, a sound of genuine, not feigned, disappointment. "Of course. I apologize, General. Force of habit. The historian in me is always trying to understand the why of things." He fell silent again, letting the quiet of the room settle around them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant chime of the grandfather clock. Friedrich found the silence more unnerving than the questions. In a typical interrogation, the silence would be a tool, meant to create pressure, to make the prisoner eager to fill it with information. But Croft's silence felt different. It was patient, contemplative. It was as if he was perfectly content to sit there all night, just sharing the warmth of the fire. The American wasn't playing a game of cat and mouse. He was changing the rules of the game entirely. He was treating Friedrich not as a captive to be broken, but as a colleague. A defeated colleague, to be sure, but a professional peer nonetheless. This subtle, pervasive courtesy was more disarming than any threat. It chipped away at the foundations of the defensive fortress Friedrich had built in his mind. He had prepared for a battle of wills against a barbarian. He had not prepared for a quiet conversation with a scholar in uniform. For the first time that day, General Major von Littenheim felt a genuine sense of unease, a feeling that he was on treacherous ground he did not understand. He had faced down artillery barrages and tank assaults, but he was beginning to suspect that the quiet, unassuming American major sitting across from him might be the most formidable opponent he had ever encountered. Section 4. The Weight of Silence. The grandfather clock in the corner of the study chimed the hour, its deep, resonant tones marking another 60 minutes of captivity. Major Samuel Croft had not pressed his line of questioning. After Friedrich's firm refusal to discuss operational matters, the American had simply nodded and fallen into a prolonged silence, a silence that Friedrich found increasingly difficult to navigate. He had been trained for hostility, for a war of words, for the mental endurance race of a classic interrogation. He was not trained for this. This quiet, this stillness, was a vacuum, and his own thoughts rushed in to fill it. He sat rigidly in the leather armchair, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames in the fireplace. But his mind was a storm of memories and anxieties. He thought of the early days of the offensive, the initial, stunning success. He remembered the feeling of exhilaration, the belief that they could still, against all odds, turn the tide of the war. He saw the faces of his junior officers, their eyes bright with a renewed sense of purpose. He had allowed himself to share in that hope, a rare indulgence for a man of his pragmatic and often pessimistic nature. Now, that memory was curdled with the bitter taste of failure. The hope had been a mirage, a cruel trick of the light before the final darkness fell. His thoughts drifted further back, to the long years on the Eastern Front. He did not dwell on the great battles, the grand encirclements, the names that would be written in the history books. Instead, his mind seized on the smaller, more personal images. A frozen sunflower field in the Ukraine, the giant heads of the flowers bowed under a blanket of snow, like a congregation of silent, grieving giants. The face of a young soldier from Bavaria, who had shared a piece of his wife's Stollen with him on Christmas Eve, 1942, only to be lost to a mortar attack the next day. The endless, featureless expanse of the steppe, a landscape so vast and empty it seemed to swallow up armies, ambitions, and men's souls. He had seen things, done things, ordered things that he had locked away in a deep, iron-bound chest in his mind. He had justified them with the cold logic of necessity, of duty, of survival. But in the disarming quiet of this comfortable room, with the scent of wood smoke and old books filling the air, the locks on that chest were beginning to rust. He could feel the pressure building within him, the weight of all those years, all those miles, all those ghosts. He glanced at Major Croft. The American was watching the fire as well, his expression thoughtful, his posture relaxed. He did not seem to be studying Friedrich or waiting for a crack in his facade. He simply seemed to be present. It was this lack of overt pressure that was so profoundly unsettling. Croft was not attacking his defenses. He was simply creating an environment in which they were becoming irrelevant, like a suit of armor in a warm drawing room. The armor was heavy, cumbersome, and utterly useless. Friedrich's mind, seeking an escape from the ghosts of the East, turned to his family. His wife Anneliese, in their home near Potsdam. He pictured her in the garden, her hands in the soil, the one place she said she could find peace. He wondered if the house was still standing. He had not received a letter in over 6 weeks. The postal service, like everything else, was collapsing. His son, Klaus, a young Hauptmann with a panzer division, was somewhere in Courland, trapped with the remnants of Army Group North. Was he still alive? Was he cold? Was he hungry? Was he, at this very moment, fighting for his life, or worse, trudging into a captivity far more brutal than this civilized, almost surreal experience? The thought was a physical blow, a tightening in his chest that made it difficult to breathe. He had raised his son to be a soldier, to follow in the family tradition. He had filled his head with the ideals of duty, honor, and sacrifice for the fatherland. And for what? So he could perish in a frozen Latvian swamp at the bitter end of a lost war? A wave of profound, soul-crushing guilt washed over him. It was a feeling he had not allowed himself to feel for a very long time. Guilt was a corrosive acid, and a commander could not afford to be corroded. He had to be strong, decisive, a figure of iron for his men. But his men were gone. His command was shattered. And here, in the silence, there was no one to be strong for but himself, and he found his own strength failing. He gripped the arms of the chair, his knuckles white, the leather straining under the pressure. He focused on his breathing, a technique he had learned as a young officer to calm his nerves before a battle. Inhale slowly. Exhale slowly. He was General Major Friedrich von Littenheim. He would not break. He would not show weakness. This American, this quiet professor, was playing a very long, very subtle game, and he would not be defeated by it. "It's the waiting that's the worst part of it, I find," Major Croft said suddenly, his voice startling Friedrich out of his spiraling thoughts. Croft was looking at him again, his gaze perceptive, as if he could see the turmoil behind the General Major's stoic mask. "Before a battle, after a battle, or even now, I suppose. Just waiting for whatever comes next." Friedrich did not reply, but the American's words resonated with a deep and unwelcome truth. He had spent a lifetime waiting, waiting for orders, waiting for the artillery to lift, waiting for the dawn, waiting for the war to end. "My father fought in the first one," Croft continued, his tone still conversational, almost gentle. "In the Meuse-Argonne. He never talked about the fighting, but he talked about the waiting, sitting in a muddy trench, waiting for the whistle to go over the top. He said your mind plays tricks on you. You think about everything you've ever done wrong, everyone you've ever let down. You think about home. You think about whether any of it makes any sense at all." Friedrich felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. The American was describing his own internal state with an unnerving accuracy. It was a probe, another attempt to find a common human experience, a bridge across the chasm of their uniforms and ideologies. "Your father's experiences are of no concern to me," Friedrich said, his voice harsher than he intended. Croft simply nodded, accepting the rebuke without offense. "You're right, of course. Forgive me." He fell silent again, and the weight of it returned, heavier than before. Friedrich realized with a sinking feeling that his harsh reply had been a mistake. It was a sign of weakness, not strength. It was the crack of a man who was losing his composure, not the cool dismissal of a man in control. The silence was not a vacuum anymore. It was a presence. It was the accumulated silence of all the things he could not say, of all the men who could no longer speak, of a future that was now a terrifying blank. The fire in the hearth burned lower, the logs collapsing into a bed of glowing, pulsating embers. The room grew dimmer, the shadows in the corners deepening. And in the growing darkness, General Major von Littenheim felt the carefully constructed walls of his identity beginning to crumble, brick by silent brick. Section 5. The Art of the Question. As the fire in the hearth settled into a deep, hypnotic glow, Major Samuel Croft shifted in his chair, the leather groaning softly in the quiet room. He had allowed the silence to do its work, to strip away the initial layers of military formality and expose the weary man beneath the uniform. Now, he decided, it was time to change his approach. He would not ask about the current offensive. The general major had made his position on that clear. Instead, he would take a different path, one that was less direct but perhaps more revealing. He picked up the manila folder from the small table, but he did not open it. He simply held it in his lap, a prop that suggested he had information, that this was not merely a casual conversation. "I was reading your file before you arrived, General," Croft began, his voice maintaining its calm, academic tone. "It's quite distinguished. The Iron Cross, First Class, in 1916 at the Somme." "You were a very young lieutenant then." Friedrich's eyes, which had been fixed on the fire, flickered towards the American, the Somme. The name was a ghost from another lifetime. It conjured images of mud, wire, and a kind of industrial-scale devastation that had seemed, at the time, to be the very zenith of human conflict. He had been a boy of 18, filled with patriotic fire. He had lost most of his platoon and a piece of his own soul in that muddy hell. "I was a soldier, doing my duty," he said, his voice low and tight. "Of course," Croft agreed. "And you continued to do it. The Reichswehr after the war, the General Staff, your service in Poland in 39, France in 40. Your record is a model of professional dedication. You are, if you'll forgive my saying so, a textbook example of the German military tradition." It was a statement of fact, not a compliment. Yet it was designed to appeal to Friedrich's pride in his profession, to the core of his identity. Friedrich remained silent, but he could not stop the flood of memories Croft's words had unleashed. He remembered the gray, lean years of the Reichswehr, the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty, the fierce pride they had taken in maintaining the embers of their military prowess against the day it would be needed again. He remembered the heady, unbelievable speed of the victory in France, the sense that they had finally avenged the defeat of 1918. He had believed in it then, in the restoration of German honor, in the genius of their strategy. "What I find interesting, from a historical perspective," Croft continued, tapping the folder lightly, "is the evolution of logistics. In the First War, your father's war, it was about railways and horsepower. In France in 1940, you demonstrated the power of mechanized logistics, the blitzkrieg, as the journalist called it. Keeping the panzers fueled and supplied was a masterpiece of planning." Croft paused, letting the statement hang in the air. He was talking about Friedrich's area of expertise. As a staff officer, and now a divisional commander, logistics were the lifeblood of his work. It was a subject he knew intimately. It was safer ground than discussing strategy, less likely to betray sensitive information. "It was a matter of calculation," Friedrich said, the words coming more easily now. "Speed was the primary weapon. The logistical tail had to be as fast as the armored spearhead. It required a new way of thinking." "Exactly," Croft said, leaning forward again, his eyes showing genuine interest. "A new way of thinking. But here, In the Ardennes, the old problems seemed to have returned. The terrain, the weather, and of course, supply lines. From our perspective, it seemed your offensive had a very limited logistical leash. Was the initial plan predicated on capturing our fuel dumps? It was a brilliant question. It was specific and technical, an appeal from one professional to another. It was not about future intentions, but about the rationale behind a past action. It invited a discussion of theory, not a betrayal of secrets. Friedrich hesitated. He was walking a very fine line, but the part of him that was the professional staff officer, the man who had spent countless hours wrestling with exactly these kinds of problems, was drawn to the question. It was a relief to think about the abstract mechanics of war instead of its brutal human cost. Every offensive is a gamble on logistics, he began, choosing his words with care. One always plans for the best-case scenario. The assumption is that rapid forward movement will secure the necessary resources. It is a calculated risk. But the calculation was off this time, Croft stated, not as an accusation but as an observation. Why? Was the intelligence faulty regarding our supply levels? Or was the timeline simply too ambitious from the start? There are always 1,000 factors, Friedrich deflected. The friction of war, as Clausewitz called it. A bridge is destroyed. A transport column is delayed by mud. A single winter storm can unravel the most meticulous plan. Clausewitz, Croft mused, a small smile on his face. Of course. War is the continuation of policy by other means. I had my students read On War. They always found it a bit dense. He had done it again. He had taken Friedrich's formal, classical reference and personalized it, brought it back to the human, relatable level of a professor and his students. It was disarming in its simplicity. Friedrich felt a strange, unfamiliar impulse. He wanted to explain. He wanted this American historian to understand the immense, impossible pressures he had been under, the unrealistic timetables sent down from the high command, the desperate shortages of fuel and equipment even before the offensive began, the knowledge, deep down, that this was a house of cards, a magnificent bold structure that the slightest gust of wind could bring crashing down. He wanted to articulate the tragedy of his position. Being a competent, professional soldier in the service of a regime that had long since departed from the rails of military and moral sanity. But he could not. Duty, ingrained in him since childhood, held his tongue. The plans were the plans, he said, his voice flat. It is a soldier's duty to execute them to the best of his ability. Croft nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on Friedrich. He had not gotten the specific intelligence he might have hoped for, but he had achieved something far more important. He had made the general talk. He had engaged him on professional ground, earned a sliver of his intellectual respect. He had opened a small door in the fortress wall. He placed the folder back on the table, as if to signal the end of that line of inquiry. The interrogation, if it could even be called that, was a slow, patient process of erosion. Croft was not trying to batter down the gates. He was content to let the wind and the rain, and the weight of the general's own memories, do the work for him. The room fell silent once more, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer a void. It was now filled with the unspoken complexities of a shared, if adversarial, profession, and the ghosts of Karl von Clausewitz and bored university students. Section 6. A crack in the iron mask. The fire had burned down to a bed of crimson embers, casting a soft, pulsing light that made the shadows in the study seem to dance. More than 2 hours had passed since Major Croft had first entered the room. The conversation, if it could be called that, had continued in fits and starts. Croft would pose a broad, almost philosophical question about the nature of command, or the difference between the fighting on the eastern and western fronts. Friedrich would respond with curt, generalized statements, giving away nothing of substance. Yet a strange rhythm had been established between them. It was a duel, fought with silence and illusion, not threats and demands. Friedrich felt his exhaustion deepening, settling into his bones like a terminal illness. The rigid posture he had maintained for hours was beginning to ache. The iron mask of the Prussian officer was growing heavier with each passing minute. He was not just tired from the day's events. He was weary from 5 long years of war, from the constant pressure of command, from the burden of sending men to their doom. He realized, with a sense of internal shock, that this was the longest he had sat in a warm, quiet room with another intelligent human being, without the imminent threat of death, or the crushing weight of operational responsibility, in a very, very long time. The setting itself was a form of psychological warfare. The comfortable chair, the warmth of the fire, the quiet dignity of the library. It was all designed to lull him, to make him forget that he was a prisoner, that the man across from him was his enemy. Croft, who had been quietly observing him, seemed to sense the shift in his prisoner's state. He knew that physical and emotional exhaustion were powerful allies in any interrogation. A tired mind was a less guarded mind. "It must be a lonely business being a general," Croft said, his voice soft, almost meditative. "You're surrounded by people, by staff officers and adjutants, but you're ultimately alone with the decisions. The responsibility for the lives of thousands of men rests on your shoulders alone." Friedrich's gaze remained on the embers, but Croft's words struck a chord deep within him. Lonely. Yes, that was the word. It was a profound and constant loneliness, a state of being he had accepted as a prerequisite of his rank. He could not show doubt or fear to his subordinates. He could not share the true weight of his burdens with his equals, for they were all rivals in the unforgiving hierarchy of the military. He could not even explain it to his wife in his letters, which were censored, and, in any case, could never convey the grim reality of his world. He was an island, and the sea around him was made of the expectations and dependencies of other men. "Responsibility is the burden of command," Friedrich said, the words sounding hollow and rehearsed even to his own ears. It was a line from a military textbook, a shield he had used 1,000 times to deflect the emotional toll of his duties. "But does the textbook tell you how to write the letters to the mothers and wives?" Croft asked, his question sharp, but his tone gentle. "Does it tell you how to look a young lieutenant in the eye and send him on a mission you know he won't be coming back from?" Friedrich's head snapped up. He stared at the American, a flare of anger in his eyes. This was a violation, a trespass into the sacred, painful ground he never allowed anyone, not even himself, to enter. "You know nothing of my duties," he hissed, his voice a low growl. Croft did not flinch. He held the general's gaze, his own eyes, filled not with triumph at having struck a nerve, but with a quiet, profound sadness. "I know that I have to do it too, on a much smaller scale. I have to send out patrols. I have to write letters home, and I know that it costs a piece of you every single time. I'm a major. I can't even imagine what it costs to be a general." The anger in Friedrich drained away as quickly as it had come, replaced by a cold, stunning sense of shock. The American was not attacking him. He was identifying with him. He was closing the distance between them, not as captor and captive, but as two men, two officers, caught on opposite sides of the same terrible machine. The shared experience, the common burden of command, was a truth so powerful that it transcended the animosity of their nations. For the first time, a genuine crack appeared in Friedrich's iron mask. His composure, the product of a lifetime of relentless self-discipline, wavered. He saw a flash of a memory, a young soldier, his face covered in mud and blood, trying to give him a letter for his mother as he lay dying on a stretcher near Smolensk. He remembered taking the letter, the paper warm and damp, and promising to send it. He never did. He couldn't. What could he say? That her son had been sacrificed for a few meaningless yards of frozen mud? He had burned the letter that night, the words of a dead boy turning to ash in his campfire. The memory, so long and brutally suppressed, returned with a raw and agonizing clarity. His carefully constructed defenses were failing. The quiet room, the patient American, the sheer, crushing weight of his own exhaustion and regret. It was all becoming too much. He looked away from Croft, back towards the dying fire, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. He felt a tremor in his hands and quickly clasped them together in his lap to still them. He was losing control. The thought terrified him more than any enemy army. He was General Major Friedrich von Littenheim, of a long and noble line of soldiers. They did not cry. They did not show emotion. They did not break. He took a slow, ragged breath, fighting to rebuild the walls that were crumbling around him. He could feel the Americans' eyes on him, but Croft had the intelligence and the grace to remain silent. He did not press his advantage. He simply waited, allowing the general to fight the battle that was now raging, not in the forests of the Ardennes, but in the desolate landscape of his own soul. The grandfather clock began to chime again, its solemn, metallic voice counting out the seconds of his slow-motion collapse. Section 7. The Offer of a Cigarette. The silence that followed. General Major von Littenheim's visible struggle was profound. It was a silence no longer defined by the absence of sound, but by the presence of a raw, unspoken emotional truth. Major Samuel Croft could see the battle playing out on the German general's face, the rigid set of his jaw, the flicker of pain in his eyes, the subtle tremor he was trying so desperately to control. Croft knew he was at a critical juncture. He could press forward, exploit the weakness, and perhaps break the general completely, forcing him to spill military secrets in a cathartic, emotional release. That would be the textbook interrogator's move. But Croft was not a textbook interrogator. He was a historian, a man more interested in understanding the human condition than in extracting data points for a military report. He saw before him not just an enemy general, but a man at the absolute end of his tether, a man buckling under a weight that Croft could only begin to imagine. In that moment, Croft made a decision that was guided not by his military manual, but by his fundamental humanity. He decided to offer a reprieve, not a final push. He reached into the pocket of his tunic and pulled out a slightly crumpled pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and entirely natural. He shook one out for himself and placed it between his lips. Then he leaned forward, extending the open pack towards General Major von Littenheim. "Cigarette, General?" he asked, his voice quiet, devoid of any hint of triumph or condescension. It was a simple question, a common courtesy offered from one man to another in a moment of shared stress. But, in the charged atmosphere of that room, in the context of everything that had come before, that simple gesture was a seismic event. For Friedrich, the world seemed to slow down. He stared at the outstretched pack of American cigarettes. The familiar green and red circle of the logo was an alien symbol, a dispatch from another universe. He had been prepared for anything: threats, psychological games, even physical violence. He had spent hours steeling himself against every conceivable form of pressure. He had not, in any way, prepared for an act of simple, mundane kindness: a cigarette. It was such a small thing. It was the currency of soldiers everywhere, a brief moment of solace in a world of hardship. He had shared cigarettes with his own men in freezing trenches. He had offered them to junior officers to calm their nerves. It was a ritual, a tiny, fragile piece of normalcy in the midst of utter madness. And now, His enemy, his captor, the man who was supposed to be his tormentor, was offering him one. The gesture cut through every layer of his training, his ideology, his ingrained hostility. It bypassed the general and spoke directly to the man. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition that beneath the uniforms, beneath the opposing flags, beneath the years of bloodshed and hatred, they were both just men caught in the same storm. The sheer, unexpected humanity of the act was like a key turning in a lock he had forgotten existed. It unlocked the iron-bound chest of his emotions, the one he had kept sealed for so long, and the contents came rushing out. He looked from the cigarette pack to Major Croft's face. He saw no cunning, no trickery. He saw only a quiet understanding in the American's eyes. It was this understanding, this moment of human connection, that finally broke him. It wasn't the defeat, or the capture, or the fear of interrogation. It was this small, unlooked-for gesture of grace. His hand, as if of its own volition, moved to take a cigarette. His fingers were trembling, not with the subtle tremor he had been fighting before, but with a deep, uncontrollable shudder. He took the thin cylinder of paper and tobacco and held it, his gaze fixed upon it, as if it were the most profound object in the world. Croft seemed to notice the shaking of the general's hand. Without a word, he took out his Zippo lighter. He flicked it open with a familiar metallic click, and a steady, yellow flame sprang to life. He leaned forward again, holding the flame to the tip of his own cigarette, and inhaled. Then, he held the lighter out for the general. Friedrich raised the cigarette to his lips. He leaned forward into the small circle of light and warmth. As the flame touched the tip, he drew in his first breath of smoke. The raw, unfamiliar taste of the American tobacco filled his lungs. It was in that moment, as he inhaled, that the first tear escaped his eye. It traced a hot, clean path through the grime on his cheek. Another followed, and then another. A deep, shuddering sob escaped his lips, a sound of such profound, wrenching grief that it seemed to be torn from the very depths of his soul. The iron mask had not just cracked, it had shattered into 1,000 pieces. The years of repressed fear, guilt, and sorrow came pouring out in a silent, agonizing flood. He did not make a sound, apart from the ragged, hitching breaths he took between the tears that now streamed freely down his face. He sat there in the firelight, a captured German general, holding an American cigarette in his trembling hand, weeping like a lost child. And across from him, Major Samuel Croft, his enemy, simply lowered his lighter, took a slow drag from his own cigarette, and gave the broken man before him the dignity of a moment to grieve for the end of his world. Section 8. The Unraveling of a Soldier. The breakdown of General Major Friedrich von Littenheim was not a loud or dramatic affair. It was a silent, complete, and devastating unraveling. The sobs that racked his body were deep and internal, shaking his broad shoulders, but producing little sound beyond the ragged intake of breath. The cigarette, still unlit in his trembling fingers, as he had failed to draw from the lighter's flame, was forgotten. His other hand came up to cover his face, a desperate, instinctive gesture to hide the utter collapse of his composure. He was not just crying, he was mourning. He was mourning for his lost division, for the thousands of young men he had led to this disastrous end. He was mourning for his son, perhaps already lost in the frozen wastes of the East. He was mourning for his country, a nation he loved, which he now saw clearly had been led down a path of madness and ruin. But most of all, he was mourning for himself, for the man he had once been, the proud, honorable soldier who believed in duty and order, a man who had become a cog in a machine of unimaginable destruction. The act of kindness from Major Croft had not caused this breakdown. It had simply been the final, gentle pressure that shattered a structure already strained to its breaking point. For years, Friedrich had existed within a rigid framework of belief. He was a German officer. The Americans were the enemy. The war was a struggle for national survival. His duty was to fight, to obey, to endure. This framework was his armor, his shelter against the horrifying realities of his work. Croft's simple, human gesture had obliterated that framework. It had presented him with a reality that his ideology could not account for. The enemy was a man who could show empathy, a man who could offer a moment of shared comfort. If the enemy was human, what did that make him? If his captor could show grace, what did that say about the cause for which he had sacrificed everything? The questions were a torrent, washing away the foundations of his identity. The carefully constructed divisions between us and them, between duty and morality, dissolved in the face of a single, offered cigarette. He saw with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity the utter futility of it all. The years of fighting, the millions of lives lost, the cities turned to rubble, the continent drenched in sorrow. All of it seemed, in that moment, a colossal, pointless waste, a grand human tragedy orchestrated by fools and madmen. He remembered standing on a hill overlooking a burning village in Russia, the smell of smoke and despair thick in the air, and feeling a cold, professional satisfaction at a successful operation. The memory now filled him with a profound sense of self-loathing. He saw the faces of prisoners his own men had taken, their eyes wide with a fear he now understood in a visceral, personal way. The distance he had always maintained, the professional detachment of the commander, was gone. He was no longer looking at the war from a map table. He was drowning in it. Major Croft sat perfectly still, enveloped in a cloud of his own cigarette smoke. He did not speak. He did not move to comfort the general. He understood that this was a private grief, a necessary and terrible catharsis. To interfere would be a violation. He had seen battle-hardened soldiers break before, but this was different. This was not the simple release of battlefield stress. This was the collapse of a man's entire worldview. He recognized the profound psychological impact of his action. By offering a cigarette, he had not offered a simple courtesy. He had offered an alternative narrative. German propaganda had painted the Americans as decadent, undisciplined gangsters, or, conversely, as soulless agents of international finance. They were not supposed to be quiet, thoughtful history professors who treated a captured general with a respect that bordered on collegial. This cognitive dissonance, coming at a moment of extreme physical and emotional vulnerability, had created a psychological short-circuit. The general's mind, unable to reconcile the reality of the situation with his ingrained beliefs, had simply given way. The grandfather clock in the corner continued its steady, indifferent ticking, marking the slow passage of time. The fire in the hearth was little more than a pile of glowing embers, providing just enough light to illuminate the scene. The weeping general, his face in his hands, and the American major, watching him through a veil of smoke with the sad, weary eyes of a man who understood the true cost of war. Minutes passed. The initial, violent storm of Friedrich's grief began to subside, leaving in its wake a state of utter, hollowed-out exhaustion. He slowly lowered his hands from his face. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face pale and slick with tears. He looked older, smaller, stripped of the authority and pride that had defined him. He looked, simply, like a tired, broken old man. He stared at the unlit cigarette still clutched in his fingers. He looked at Major Croft, his expression a mixture of shame, confusion, and a strange, nascent sense of liberation. The iron mask was gone, and he had no idea what lay beneath it. He began, his voice a hoarse, broken whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again. Apologize, Major. This is unbecoming of an officer. Croft took a final drag from his cigarette and slowly exhaled, the smoke curling towards the high, shadowed ceiling. He looked at Friedrich, not with pity, but with a deep, abiding compassion. "There is nothing to apologize for, General," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You've just been at war for a very long time." The simple statement was a validation, an absolution. It was permission for Friedrich to be human again. And in that moment, the formal relationship of captor and captive, of American and German, of victor and vanquished, ceased to exist. They were just two men, sitting by a dying fire in the heart of a war-torn continent, bearing witness to the profound and terrible fragility of the human soul. Section 9. The Aftermath of the Storm. In the aftermath of the emotional storm, a profound quiet settled over the study, different from the tense, weighted silence that had preceded it. It was the quiet of exhaustion, of release. General Major Friedrich von Littenheim sat slumped in the armchair, the rigid military posture he had maintained for so long completely gone. He looked like a puppet whose strings had been cut. He repeatedly brought the unlit American cigarette to his lips and then lowered it, a nervous, unconscious gesture. Major Samuel Croft stubbed out his own cigarette in a small porcelain ashtray on the table. He did not immediately press his advantage or resume any form of questioning. He understood that the dynamic in the room had irrevocably shifted. This was no longer an interrogation. It was something else, something far more human and complex. He waited, giving the general the space to reorient himself, to find some semblance of footing on this new, uncertain ground. Finally, Friedrich spoke, his voice quiet and raspy, stripped of its former command authority. "You are very clever, Major." It was not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact, tinged with a weary resignation. "You did what no one else could have done." Croft shook his head slowly. "That wasn't my intention, General. I'm not a trained interrogator. As I said, I'm a historian. I was just trying to understand." "And what have you understood?" Friedrich asked, his gaze distant, as if looking at something far beyond the walls of the room. "I've understood that you and I are not as different as our uniforms might suggest," Croft replied honestly. "We are both men who have been given responsibilities we never asked for, in a world we did not create." Friedrich gave a short, humorless laugh. It was a dry, cracking sound. "A world we have helped to destroy." He looked at his hands, at the fingers that had signed orders, drawn lines on maps, and sent thousands of men into the crucible. "I believed in the necessity of it. I believed in the logic, order, discipline, strength. I believed that these things could conquer the chaos. But the chaos was always greater. It devours everything in the end. Order, discipline, men." He fell silent, lost in his own bleak thoughts. The confession, though not of military secrets, was more profound. It was the confession of a man reckoning with the failure of his entire life's philosophy. Croft recognized this as the true moment of surrender, a surrender not of an army, but of a soul. "Perhaps the only thing that can stand against the chaos," Croft said softly, "are the small things. The things we forget about when we're looking at the grand maps." Friedrich looked up, his eyes questioning. "Small things?" "A shared cigarette," Croft said. "A moment of quiet. A recognition of the other man's humanity. Maybe that's all we have to hold on to." For a long moment, Friedrich von Littenheim simply stared at the American major, the historian, the professor of ancient Rome. This man, his enemy, was offering him not condemnation, not a demand for information, but a piece of philosophy, a sliver of hope in the darkness. "I had a son," Friedrich said suddenly, the words tumbling out, quiet and full of pain. His name is Klaus, a captain. On the Eastern Front, I have not heard from him in many weeks. He was not giving away intelligence. He was sharing a burden, the most human burden of all. He was a father, afraid for his child. Croft's expression softened. I have a daughter, he said. Her name is Sarah. She's 7. She likes to draw pictures of horses. Every letter I get from her, I read it 100 times. I keep them here. He tapped the breast pocket of his tunic. In that moment, the vast gulf between them, of nationality, of ideology, of rank, vanished completely. They were simply two fathers, far from home, terrified of the world they were leaving for their children. The conversation that followed was unlike any that Friedrich had ever had. He spoke of his youth, of the shame of Germany after the Great War, of the seductive promise of restored national pride. He spoke of the camaraderie of the officer corps, of the intellectual beauty of a perfectly executed battle plan. He did not make excuses for his actions, but, prompted by Croft's quiet, intelligent questions, he tried to explain them, as much to himself as to the American. He talked about the Eastern Front, not in terms of strategy, but in terms of the vast, crushing scale of the landscape and the conflict, the way it seemed to strip away all sense of individual humanity. He described the grim, attritional nature of the fighting, so different from the swift campaign in France. Croft listened patiently, not as an interrogator, but as a historian collecting a first-hand oral account, a testament from a man who had stood at the heart of the storm. He did not judge. He only sought to understand. When Friedrich finally fell silent, the exhaustion was absolute. He had talked for over an hour, emptying himself of the memories and burdens he had carried alone for years. The room was growing cold, the fire now just a pale gray ash. Dawn was not far off. Croft stood up. You should get some rest, General. We can continue this another time. Friedrich nodded numbly. He felt empty. But it was not a bad emptiness. It was the clean, quiet emptiness after a fever has broken. Croft opened the study door. The guard, who had been standing patiently outside all this time, snapped to attention. Sergeant, Croft said, please escort the general to the guest quarters in the East Wing. See that he gets food, water, and a chance to sleep. He is not to be disturbed. Sir, the sergeant replied, his eyes wide with curiosity. As Friedrich stood up, his legs unsteady, he looked at Major Croft one last time. The words of thanks felt inadequate, absurd. Instead, he simply met the American's gaze and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a nod of acknowledgement, of understanding, of a strange and profound connection forged in the crucible of a single night. As he was led away down the corridor, Friedrich von Littenheim, the captured enemy, felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt that he had been seen, not as a symbol, not as a rank, not as an enemy, but simply as a man. And in the heart of his defeat it felt strangely, like a kind of victory. Section 10. The Ripple of Humanity. The story of General Major Friedrich von Littenheim's capture and subsequent breakdown did not end in that firelit study. It rippled outwards. A small stone of human interaction dropped into the vast, violent ocean of the war. Major Samuel Croft's official report was a model of discretion. He detailed the general's capture and the basic, non-sensitive military information von Littenheim had provided after his composure had failed. He made a footnote about the general's emotional state, attributing it to extreme combat fatigue. He made no mention of the cigarette. That was not something that belonged in a military file. It was a piece of history, not of intelligence. Yet the informal story, the legend of the cigarette interrogation, began to circulate in hushed tones among the officers of the division. It was not told as a tale of clever psychological trickery, but as something more curious, a testament to Major Croft's unorthodox and surprisingly effective methods. It became a quiet example that coercion and brutality were not always the most effective tools, that sometimes a flicker of shared humanity could accomplish what threats could not. For General Major von Littenheim, the war was over. He was transferred to a prisoner of war camp for senior officers, first in England, then later in the United States. His experience with Major Croft had fundamentally changed him. The iron shell of the Prussian officer was gone forever, replaced by a quieter, more contemplative man. He cooperated with his captors, not by betraying military secrets, but by providing insights into the mindset of the German General Staff and the internal politics of the Wehrmacht. Information that proved valuable to Allied historians and analysts trying to understand how the war had happened. He spent his days reading philosophy and history, corresponding with his wife, who had survived the end of the war, and trying to make sense of the path his life had taken. He often thought of Major Croft and their conversation that night. The American had given him something more valuable than a cigarette. He had given him back a piece of his own humanity, a piece he thought had been lost forever in the snows of Russia. He had allowed him to see the world, and himself, not through the distorting lens of ideology, but with the clear, painful vision of a man stripped of all illusions. After the war, Friedrich was repatriated to Germany in 1947. He did not re-enter public life. He retired to a small cottage with his wife and spent his final years gardening and writing his memoirs. They were not the typical memoirs of a general, filled with justifications and strategic analysis. Instead, they were a quiet, searching reflection on the nature of duty, the corrosion of ideology, and the profound human cost of conflict. In a chapter near the end, he told the story of his capture, of the quiet American major, and of the offered cigarette that had shattered his world, only to rebuild it on a new foundation of humility and grace. He never named the major, referring to him only as the historian. Major Samuel Croft finished his service and returned to the United States. He went back to his university, to his quiet life of teaching and writing. He rarely spoke of his experiences in the war and never mentioned the incident with the German general. To his students, he was simply Professor Croft, a kind, thoughtful man who could make the campaigns of ancient Rome feel immediate and relevant. But the war had left its mark on him too. He taught history with a new depth of understanding, a keen awareness of the human element that lay beneath the grand narratives of battles and empires. He emphasized to his students that history was not just a collection of dates and facts, but the accumulated story of individual human choices, of moments of cruelty and moments of grace. In 1953, a colleague who read German passed him a translated copy of a recently published memoir by a former German general. The colleague pointed out a particular chapter, thinking Croft, as a military historian, would find it interesting. Croft read the chapter, the one about the historian, and a slow, sad smile touched his lips. He closed the book and placed it on his shelf, among his volumes on Caesar and Scipio Africanus. The story was a quiet testament, a ripple from that single night in the Ardennes. It was proof that even in the darkest of times, in the heart of the most brutal conflict in human history, the capacity for human connection endures. It is a fragile thing, easily extinguished, but it is also a powerful, transformative force. The story of the general who broke, not under interrogation, but in the face of a simple act of kindness, serves as a timeless and vital reminder. It teaches us that victory is not always measured in territory gained or enemies vanquished. Sometimes, the greatest victory lies in the simple, courageous act of recognizing the humanity in another, and in doing so, reclaiming our own. It is a lesson written not in the grand histories of war, but in the quiet, unrecorded moments between two men by the light of a dying fire, a lesson about the enduring power of a single, offered cigarette.